editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. It's a great pleasure to be back in Davos. I'm sure many of you, for some of you it's the first time. For many of us it's good to be back in somewhat different circumstances than we're used to, but it's a great pleasure to see, actually it's a great pleasure to look out and see green rather than white. So it's great to be here. Thank you very much indeed for joining this session on resilience. I think we've fair to say in the last couple of years we've all, in a very personal and human sense, learnt the value and the importance of resilience. Some of us have become more, I think we've all become more resilient over the last couple of years. But we're going to explore this topic of resilience today from a broader economic, societal, business perspective, and the importance of building resilience in organizations, in societies, in companies. It's obviously not just a pandemic, which has really brought home this message to us. We've had tremendous geopolitical shocks. The war in Ukraine right now has reminded us again of the way in which our lives and our economies and our societies can be disrupted. We've seen increasing geopolitical tension between particularly the US and China over the last 5 or 6 years, with implications that has for economic relations, geopolitical relations. And of course all of this against the long-term backdrop of climate change and other environmental challenges. And all of these things coming together in various ways and requiring us to adapt, be flexible, and of course to acquire and build the elements of resilience that enable us to withstand, not only withstand future shocks, but actually to adapt and to build and grow from those shocks. So we're going to explore all this with a terrific panel who are very well schooled in this topic. And as you know, on my immediate left, of course, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the Director General of the World Trade Organization, a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. To her left, Bob Sternfels, Global Managing Partner at McKinsey. And McKinsey have just written a report, which many of you may have seen on this very topic, and I'm going to ask Bob to talk through some of the elements of that. And on the far left, my far left, to your right, Roy Gori, who's President and Chief Executive of Manulife in Canada. So thank you again for joining us. Let's get straight into it. I'm going to ask, if I may, a sort of methodological question. I'm going to ask you all, if you would, to define what we mean by resilience in this context. Again, I think we all understand the meaning of human resilience, but what does it mean in terms of the various walks of life that you're in, but also in terms of what it means for how societies and companies can actually, how they have to deal with shocks, and what it means to become to build resilience within an organization. Ngozi, if I could start with you, what's your understanding of what resilience means?
Well, thank you. Let me make a couple of points. I think that it's very right to start by asking, what does resilience mean? But you have to think about resilience in the context of the world we live in now. We're in a world of simultaneous crises, all happening at once. A global health crisis, a food security crisis, an international security crisis, the climate crisis. So what does resilience mean at this time? Surely, if you look at all these crises, you see they share one thing in common, which is that they're kind of problems of the global commons, meaning that no one country alone can solve the problem. So to me, if that's the case, resilience means it's not that we all have to survive together and sustain together. And to do that, you cannot have resilience unless you have global solidarity. And that has a lot of implications. Maybe we'll come to them, but one of them surely is, if resilience for all of us needs global solidarity, then how do you finance that resilience? Who pays when you have global public bads? So that's what it's: survival together, it's supporting each other, it's financing together, it's recognizing that my resilience cannot happen unless your resilience also happens.
Bob Sternfels, again, as I say, McKinsey's just authored a report on this, and I should also say the World Economic Forum has launched the Resilience Consortium with McKinsey, and Bob, I know you're very much part of that, and I think many of you probably here in the audience are too. Bob, Ngozi's given us a very important sort of global perspective on on resilience and how to achieve it. What, from your perspective, and particularly with the experience of this report that you've done, how would you define what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, I'd love to jump in. It's also great to be here, great to see everybody. We are very excited to be a founding member, both in terms of the Resilience Consortium with the World Economic Forum, and also to co-publish the paper that you mentioned, which hopefully is a start to accelerate conversation on this important topic. You know, as I wade into it, I guess the part I would build on, Ngozi, that you talked about is the imperative for this, even before you get to definition. And one of the things that I think is both concern and hope as we deal with several of these crises at a rate that we've never had before is how do we avoid what I'd call an or-based conversation and embrace an and-based conversation. So many of the debates over the last couple of days have framed, do we need to trade growth to solve inflation? Because of the geopolitical crises, does this put climate transition commitments on hold? If we really want to be inclusive, how many GDP points come off global growth? And those are all or. Right? One of the things that I get so excited about with resiliency is, can it allow us to lean into and-based solutions? Can we have growth that's inclusive? Can we actually think about climate transitions while companies continue to thrive? And can we think about a world that, when we make the climate transitions, is not regressive to the vast majority of people who live on this earth? And so I think the imperative for me is this: it allows us to lean into and, as opposed to default to or. If you then kind of push me on the definition part, because I think it's a great place to start, I would build on this interdependence notion and push us to define a very broad, and maybe it's multiple lenses to resilience. I think there clearly is a resilience lens that is organizational. Whether that organization is public, private, how do I define and manage resiliency in the entity that I lead? One lens. I think there's another lens, which is the interdependencies around value chains. When you start to think about end-to-end value chains, agriculture, commerce, payments, et cetera, multiple players need to collaborate to actually deliver something to a citizen. How do we think about resiliency from an end-to-end value chain point of view? And maybe the last part to this is at the personal level, personal resilience. And we were talking beforehand, and one of the fascinating conversations I've had with multiple CHROs in large enterprise is how much of your upskilling and training goes to building personal resilience in your employee base? And the reality is very little. So is there an aspect here where we build this as a skill? Right? Let's build this as a skill. So I would tee up this notion of maybe multiple lenses to the definition of resilience.
Roy Gori, from the perspective of a major financial institution, asset manager, an insurance company, how do you approach the idea of resilience? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think there's some great comments that have been provided by the panel so far. I would definitely agree with everything that's been said. I think in its simplest form, resilience is the ability to deal with challenges that could disrupt you, whether that's disrupt you as a corporation, you as an individual, or you as a government, and ultimately a country. Now that sounds simple, but that's easier said than done. It's incredibly complex because the likelihood of these disruptions is often very low, and the investment to deal with those disruptions can be very, very high. And in this world, we often think about investments from a capital perspective and a return on capital, and it's often very hard to justify investments that may be necessary for an event that may not occur. If you think back to 2019, there are very few people that would have said that we need to build resilience for a pandemic that would span the world and basically disrupt us for 2.5 years. And as a result of that, we don't put the necessary ingredients in place to actually deal with that kind of disruption. So for me, when I think about resilience, I think, A, there's a proactive element of trying to anticipate what are the things that could disrupt us and create challenge. How do we think about preparing for them? even if they are low probability and low likelihood. But then equally important, how do we build a capability to react? Because you can't anticipate every possible disruption, and therefore you need to build a muscle, which is often cultural in nature, which allows you to adapt to a challenge or a disruption or an event that could be very problematic. And that's really very difficult. And I just finally add that most humans, and certainly most leaders, are optimists. They typically look at the world from a glass half full perspective. So they don't want to spend time thinking about the things that could go wrong. And because of that, they don't put the time and effort into thinking about what they need to do to build resilience for those events.
Ngozi, you made the very important point about global sort of the interconnectedness and the interdependence. With these shocks that come along, shocks are by definition unpredictable. Just as as Roy just said, no, we weren't really thinking in late 2019 about a global pandemic. As late as January of this year, again, Bob and Roy and I were just talking about this beforehand. We weren't. Although we were aware of what was going on between Russia and Ukraine and that tensions were rising, I don't think most people were thinking this is going to result in a war, which is going to have massive disruption, particularly things like global food supplies. How do we get into that? How do we obviously we all tend to be focused on things that we think are going to be challenges, which are challenges, and then something by definition a shock comes along which affects us. How do we develop the institutional approach, the mindset to make us flexible enough to deal with these shocks that are genuine shocks that we are genuinely not prepared for?
Well, let me step back and disagree with you a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Some of this, you're right, but there were some shocks that were a little bit predictable. Everybody will remember the famous, even Bill Gates in 2015, who did this video. Scientists, we have to listen to science. They've been warning us of some of these things, because if we are destroying our environment, the interaction between animal, environment, human is really heavy, and that there will be consequences, including potential for pandemics. But because, as Roy said, the policymakers and politicians, their mind frame is short term. They don't really want to. I mean, when I was finance minister, just trying to get Parliament, the National Assembly, to support ensuring our own buildings and our own assets was difficult, because, insurance was something that may not happen. It's not something so obvious when you have immediate needs of villagers who need to be financed for this or that. So we did get some, but we didn't prepare. So that's the first point, and I'll come back to that. But to your mind, the institutions. Remember, the world built up a set of multilateral institutions post-World War II, which the whole rationale was to solidify international interdependence and solidarity, and have these multilateral institutions and organizations that would help us solve these problems. But the point is, and they are needed, so we shouldn't draw the conclusion from what is happening, which is what some people are doing, that now multilateralism doesn't work, we need to forge our own ways, we break into blocks. The point is that it hasn't kept up with 21st century challenges. So the institutions we need, we've not made them fit for purpose. So we ought to be looking at issues of the global commons, which is what we're struggling with now, saying, are institutions fit to detect this, to prepare for it, to have the financing base necessary to help solve that problem? So I think we have the institutions. We just have not reformed them to be able to deal with these issues. And my institution, the WTO, is one that I think needs to be brought up and made fit for purpose. It's terribly important, has a huge agenda, but it needs to reform. So to end, I think, yes, we have the institutions, but we've lost the feeling of global solidarity. If you don't have that, then you cannot even make these institutions work the way that they should. So how do we regain that global solidarity? Why is it all right that we say we are in it together, and developed countries are prepared to spend up to 26% of GDP sometimes in fiscal stimulus and monetary easing, to help the economy to recover, which is appropriate. $14 trillion. But I was on a high-level panel with the senior minister of Singapore and with Larry Summers on preparedness for pandemics. And we're recommending $75 billion over 5 years that the world should put aside with a fund for $10 billion a year to, and it's difficult to get there. How do you spend 14 trillion, but you can't find 75 billion?
It's the old phrase that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
How is it that for financing climate change, we can't find 100 billion we've been promising the developing countries for years? You know, it defies belief.
Bob, companies, I think, tend to see, understandably, rightly, a lot of the processes necessary to build resilience as costs. They are a lot of it. Take for example the disruptions we've seen to the global supply chain. You know, in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. The way to build resilience against that is to have alternatives, but which involves building in a degree of redundancy, presumably a degree of latency. You know, as Roy said, these measures are low return, and also they're measures that are you know, sort of you hope and you generally expect most of the time are not going to be needed. How do you get? So how do companies, you know, how does a CEO or the CFO of a company approach that? Manage to find ways in which building that resilience is not just simply this sort of dead weight costs that you have to build into an organization to protect yourself.
Well, you know, it's fascinating because actually, when we look at this over the right time frames, those investments are not low return. Right? And I think this is the big understanding that we need to make. And you know, I'm from McKinsey, so if I didn't bring some data, you know, folks would be a little miffed. And we did some work with our McKinsey Global Institute, looking at two lenses, one at a global lens and then at a company lens. And at a global lens, the cost of not getting resilience right over the course of this decade could be anywhere between 1 to 5 percentage points of GDP growth. Right? That is massively material. That is not a non-return investment, right, in aggregate for the world. It's a massive return for investment if we think about the impact between 1 to 5% of GDP growth. We then broke it down at a company level against a standard framework. And if you look at the resiliency report, very much along your lines, Roy, we looked at companies across 3 simple components of resiliency. How well did they prepare? How well did they invest in perceiving? And how well did they invest in propelling? Massive reallocation of resource and then using some of the countermeasures to create strategic advantage. Those are the kind of the 3 things, right? Prepare, perceive, propel. And we looked at companies going through the 08-09 financial crisis and followed them all the way through that business cycle. And what you found was companies that were better on these resiliency scores performed 20% better in terms of total shareholder returns than companies that weren't. There was a real return. We've then started tracking this since the beginning of the pandemic, start January 2020 till now. And I realize we're not through that business cycle yet, but let's monitor the data as we go. Companies that are more resilient now, that 20% number escalates to 50%. 50% greater total shareholder returns than companies that aren't resilient. So there is an economic case to this that I think we need to make more transparent using the right definitions and the right timeframes.
Roy, both Bob and Ngozi have talked about the importance of a long-term perspective. Yeah. As a financial institution, which a life insurer, asset manager, you know, you do have the ability to do that. How is it, you know, to Bob's point from that very interesting study about, you know, the long-term returns from building resilience? How does that affect you, the way you approach? You know, we've all got used to ESG, the importance of ESG in investing. To what extent does this play into your investing considerations too?
In a very big way. And actually, just to punctuate Bob's point, actually an interesting statistic that really drives home for me the fact that resilience isn't being prioritized enough is that if you look at the Fortune 500 today, there are only 52 companies in the Fortune 500 that actually were in the Fortune 500 in 1955. So for me, that's a great proof point that this is not an area of focus for organizations, and there are a lot of reasons for that, as we've discussed. Specifically for our industry, we are quite unique in that people buy products for us that they don't expect to have us deliver or fulfill on for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years' time. We've operated for 160 years, and that is our strength. Our strength is that people trust us to be there 50 years from now to help support them in a difficult time. So they give us their money, and we invest. And with that horizon in mind, we can invest with a framework of not just delivering results for the next quarter or the next year, but we can think about things from a 20, 30, 40, 50-year time horizon perspective. And I think that really is quite unique, and I think that does aid to the ability to create capital for resilience and for the importance of longevity. So we're investing very heavily in climate, we're investing in timberland, farmland. In fact, we've planted more than 1.25 billion trees in the last 3 decades. Now, if you looked at timberland, for example, as an investment asset class, just in a 1 or 2 year time horizon, you wouldn't go anywhere near it. But if you think about that as an asset class with a 30-year time horizon, it's a phenomenal asset class. And when timber prices aren't great, you just don't touch it. You leave it, and it grows, which makes it more valuable when prices are appropriate. So we do that in a very sustainable way. We replant, and again, as a result of that, we have more than 2 billion trees that we support. But I think to your point, I think our industry can play a key role. I think we can partner with government. I think we need to bring to the fore the importance of thinking about things from a longer term horizon perspective, because I think, as Ngozi mentioned earlier, we're all very short-term oriented, and that's something we need to change. In addition to being an insurance company, we're also an asset manager. We have more than $700 billion worth of assets under management that we manage for third parties, for customers. And there, I think we need to do a better job as an industry. And I think the better job includes providing asset classes for consumers such that they can choose where they want to make their investments and where they can focus on resilience as an asset class and a priority area. For example, food scarcity. So I think we, as an asset management industry, haven't done a good enough job in providing customers with options. We're doing a better job on climate change now, maybe too late, but there are a whole lot of other asset classes that we need to provide as an option for consumers to make the investments that are necessary so that they can actually deliver in the long run.
Go ahead, Ngozi.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that you and Bob alluded to. It's the issue of supply chains. And you know, so resilience in supply chains is now, there's a risk of it being defined as friend-shoring, secure trade, and
reshoring, and
well, reshoring, nearshoring, friend-shoring, just in time, just in case, all the words. But what I want to say is the point I made. In our quest for resilience, we have to be very careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and to be careful what we are defining. Now, some people are saying resiliency of supply chains does not mean that you reshore or you friend-shore. I'll come back to friend-shoring. When you reshore, and I think businesses, when I talk to them, they're not thinking the way policymakers are thinking. So reshoring, bringing everything as much as you can back home or next door is risky. Because if you concentrate all of those things there, if there's some event that happens, then you risk losing all. And in this era of climate change, we cannot predict what things. So we have to be careful. Will there be some reshoring and nearshoring? Yes, but we should be careful it doesn't become the objective we pursue in terms of our public policy. Now, when I talk to businesses, they talk about diversifying risks in their supply chain. They don't really use all these reshoring and friend-shoring words. And that's fine. If you want to diversify, deconcentrate your supply chain, I think that's a good thing, because we've all seen the vulnerability in having them concentrated in certain places. And what I would love to see is businesses using this to involve those who have been marginalized or not brought into the global value chain in. So if you want to diversify your risk, why can't you look for another emerging market or developing country with the right environment and put your manufacturing there? That would be a way of re-globalizing the world, not deglobalizing it. And so that's, but if we do the other thing, we shouldn't be subsidizing so much and saying we are friendshoring for us to locate industry in places that may not be the most competitive. So I just want to point to that let's let businesses make their decisions. If we want to interfere a little bit because we want some certainty on semiconductors and all that, okay, but let not that become the main policy.
Yeah, Bob, sorry.
Sorry, just maybe one, because I'm very passionate on this one too, and I think to the upside potential of these. We've been thinking about these a lot as defensive maneuvers, but if you thought about supply chain, to your point, and you thought about actually creating networks of supply chain as opposed to single point accountability supply chain. And when you then look from an private enterprise point of view, the massive set of ancillary SMEs that grow around decisions around supply chains as networks, it starts to drive growth that's inclusive. And I actually think that then becomes a catalyst not only for more resilience, because now we have networks of supply chains around the world, but it also drives SME growth and more participation, the next set of innovations.
And growth of women-owned enterprises.
Well, and where I was going to just maybe one more push on this, because you can see we're getting excited, is I think we could think about both physical and virtual supply chains in this. And now let's link a crisis with an opportunity. So the pandemic helped all of us in large global enterprise rethink how work can get done. And I think one of the biggest things is it democratized how to deliver expertise, particularly for expertise-heavy industries. And one of the things that we learned in McKinsey was that we could deliver expertise from anywhere in the world. And it's given rise to a fundamental rethink of where our knowledge centers could be. And so in partnership with companies like Amazon and African Leadership Academy, we're actually creating global knowledge centers in Africa. Cape Town and Kenya become sources for us now, which is a more resilient answer for how I'm going to deal with talent shortages worldwide. But also it's more resilient because I now have 50 centers around the world rather than 2 or 3 big ones. So it might not only be physical supply.
And goes to your point also about that reshoring, friendshoring is not necessarily improving the security. I don't know how many of you here are in the US or are familiar with what's going on in the US. The US is at the moment going through a massive supply crisis in the infant formula and with baby milk formula essentially. And that's largely because it's almost entirely sort of self-dependent, sort of autarkic, and one major plant has shut down. So we've got to the situation where the United States has literally been sending military aircraft around the world to find supplies of from other countries, mostly friendly countries, I think, but from other countries to bring baby formula. So it is a good point, but isn't the point? I want to come back to this too, but maybe Roy can talk about that. But despite that, isn't from most companies' point of view, friendshoring is, whether you like it or not, is a reality. I mean, that when companies are faced with the kind of shock that they've seen in the last 2 years, they're faced with increasing geopolitical risk, you know, and all of the challenges that we've seen there. Isn't it, maybe Roy, I can ask you that, isn't it just whatever the long-term objective may be, isn't it inevitable that companies are going to seek to have their supplies in places that they regard as reliable? And by the way, you know, to your point, Bob, about digital, about, you know, it's virtual, as one of the great shocks that I think all companies and all organizations are building resilience for is cyber risk, right? We're all doing that right now. And again, doesn't that given, you know, perhaps this is a very American perspective, I am in the United States, but the threats seem to be from overseas, you know, from unfriendly governments and organizations overseas. And so isn't there a kind of just an inevitability about this process of friendshoring or reshoring? Roy, to your point.
I think it's a great question, and I think Ngozi is right. I think what happens when you have an event is that the pendulum swings to the complete opposite direction, because that's the easy and simple answer. It's not always the right answer, though. And I think it's the lever that often gets played and pulled, and it can be and often is very political. I think the right answer is to deal with the problem at hand. And the problem is, as we just described, when it comes to supply chains, you want resiliency in your supply chains. Being dependent on one market or one country is not good business. And therefore, is the solution to completely onshore your supply chains? Probably not necessarily. And I think there is probably going to be a mixture of onshoring, but then a combination of multiple sites just on the point of manufacturing to provide you with the confidence that if an event did happen, and again, you can't predict the event. I think the worst mistake that you can make when you think about resiliency is anticipate that future events are going to be the same as the ones that happened in the past.
Right.
So I think there is a pendulum shift. I think there's a huge recency bias that dictates the often easy solution, which isn't necessarily the right one. And I think leaders need to think a bit more thoughtfully about this and come up with the game plan that actually goes to the heart of the issue. And often that is providing diversification. And just on the supply chain point, diversification that allows them to navigate not just a crisis of an event like we've just experienced, but all different types of crises that could possibly come up. The biggest issue for us is that we look at the future through the lens of the past, right, and that's not the best lens.
I want to talk about that. I want a couple more questions from me, and then please questions from the audience. Bob, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to close out the friend shoring, because I actually might push us that the term itself is a loaded term. Because the term implies friends and not friends.
Yeah.
As opposed to how do we think about more resilient supply chains? And if we move past that and we could underpin and with the WTO and others, establish some sense of standards and trust to facilitate trade. Right? You move past is it friendshoring or not, and more about can I look at long-term trends around talent markets, around technology, around energy. And I think it then leads you to fascinating things. I was in Monterrey, Mexico in our office last week. Northern Mexico is booming. Right? It's absolutely booming, not for the reason of, is that a friend, but when you look at the technical talent in northern Mexico for high-end manufacturing, the labor costs, the supply chain, it makes sense for a large chunk of North America. But the term is a loaded term, and I think it leads us to the wrong types of decisions framed that way.
To Roy's point, Bob, I did want to ask you the sort of the danger of recency. I mean, there's an old expression, of course, that armies always fight the last war. We all know that. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows that the next war is not going to be like the last war. We all know it. We all supposedly prepare for it. But sure enough, the next war comes along and we think we're fighting the last one. How do you, obviously without knowing what the next, forgive the martial language, but what measures do you put in place? How do you prepare an organization to not to fight the last war, not to address the shock that you just dealt with, but to have the flexibility to deal with whatever, the shock, whatever it may be? I mean, what are the specific things we were just talking beforehand about? Is this being taught in business schools? Is this being taught is this part of the process of learning that companies put their employees through? What can we do to address that? Bob, I'll start with you.
Well, I'd love to weigh in, and I think it starts with, rather than a mindset of how can I identify every potential future shock, which is a discrete view of the world. How do I build my organization to be able to deal with things that I can't foresee? And where my mind goes on that are a couple things. First is, can we start to define how resilient an organization or a value chain is? And there are a set of metrics that yield, and I think we could push a little further, and you'll see this in the report, a plea to, can we start creating standards to define resilience? If you can start to define standards, leaders can then start to measure against it. After you start to measure against it, you start to say, how do I change my organization from a design point of view to build more resilience? Right. I've asked questions, everything from a CEO saying, should I have a chief resilience officer? Is that part of a top team going forward? Through to, how do I think about capital allocation to be able to have reserve to reallocate when future shocks come, and what should that reserve be? Through to the individual skill level. From a CHRO that I mentioned in the beginning, how much training budget should I put against individual building of that resilient skill? And that would, I would imagine, work back to business school. So I guess my mind goes to more of an org design question than a strategic question, in this.
Ngozi?
Yeah, I was going to say that, for businesses, maybe it's a little more tractable. For countries, you also need to build resilient economies and societies. And that's not so easy, given the complexities of politics and policy. But definitely one of the things I'm thinking about is that, you know, each government ought to have some chief risk officer.
Yeah.
You know, and
Or maybe chief resilience
or
officer.
chief resilience, whatever. But somebody needs
Minister
to,
for Resilience.
yeah.
So-
No, not a minister. You know, that will create another bureaucracy that, you know, will not lead to any resilience. No, you just need someone to scan the horizon and be asking the question.
Yeah.
What should we be looking out for? And it will be both local as well as global, because there are also local things that challenge resiliency. So that's what goes to my mind. You know, having been in government for quite some time, there's a need. The other thing on the governmental level is the ability to spring to and have the financing to deal with that matter. This is not trivial. Very often we don't build into our budgets that cushion that when something happens, you know, you suddenly you're able, you know, you have to do something. For those who can print money, great. You know, but if you're in an economy that cannot do that, you really need to start thinking of a contingency fund. And we did have such a thing when I was in government in Nigeria for some time, whereby if a disaster happened, you could draw on it. Because the speed with which you react when something happens is important. That's how people judge whether they're safe with you as a government or not. So grosso modo, I think we need some thinking about this on the governmental level. We obviously need to plan where we think we know a little bit of what might make us non-resilient, like now pandemics. We have no excuse now not to have a pandemic preparedness fund, not to be able to fund the scanning of where those risks might come from, not to have a governance system that brings together different parts of the world to try and think through what this means and strengthen those organizations like the WHO that can deal with this globally. So number one, we know some of these things, but we are not yet prepared. So let's prepare for the ones we know. Two, for the ones we don't know, because as my colleagues are saying, you can't know everything. Build your society or your business in such a way you can respond. And that means having some reserve capacity to spring back and having someone who is thinking about the problem. You know, nobody is there thinking every day about what is going to happen with climate change. You need someone to think about it and then get you prepared.
Questions? Anybody? Questions? Yes, lady at the back there, please.
Thank you. Sarah Williamson from FCLT Global. Maybe this is for Roy mostly, but for all of you, I'm really interested in how investors think about resilience. And we know in, for example, the high yield market, those investors have been taught to think about resilience, because if you're a high yield issuer and you go through a bump, you're out.
Yeah.
But the equity investors haven't typically, thank you, equity investors haven't typically thought about resilience in the same way. And there's a concern that if a company has too much cash on their balance sheet, people want buybacks, or, you know, an activist will see this as fat. So how do we take this resilience mindset, which actually our fixed income colleagues probably understand, and translate that to the equity side?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I think it's lacking today. And in the ideal world, I think there is a premium for resilience in equity markets. It doesn't exist today. And I think, again, what equity investors typically want is the best return, and they typically look at it from a horizon of the next quarter or the next year. I think when you have events like we've just experienced over the last couple of years, resilience and the premium to resilience increases quite dramatically. My fear is that in years to come, that wanes and we go back to the habits of the past. But I think you raise an awesome point, and I think organizations should be given credit for their ability to demonstrate resilience. As Bob highlighted, you know, the facts prove themselves that resilient organizations can actually outperform over time. The question is, as an investor, do you know exactly which of those companies are more resilient than others? It's not so transparent. So I think we as corporations need to do a better job of articulating, and not in a sales kind of way, but in a quantifiable and transparent way, how resilient we are. We have to be able to demonstrate that over time. And I think investors will start to provide and give a premium for that, which if you've got two options, two companies that are delivering the same returns quarter in, quarter out, but one is deemed to be more resilient than the other, they should have more investment-focused demand and attention. Now that is the holy grail. So I think your question is a great one. I think the challenge for us is how do we actually build that resilience premium into markets? And you're right, in the fixed income space, specifically for high income, it's there to some extent, but it needs to be there on the equity side as well.
Roy, I just wonder, back to that, perhaps an opportunity for some cross-player collaboration to define a set of standards, because that could then lead to disclosure, to lead to transparency, which then could ultimately lead to, is there a premium associated with companies that are better on these metrics than ones that aren't?
Because it is a good question, because again, you can imagine if you're a CEO of a company that you're faced with this quarterly challenge of defending everything you're doing to a very, very skeptical market audience. I mean, how do we elevate maybe the transparency here that Roy is talking about to get so that the investors, so that those Wall Street analysts will actually give the right amount of credit when it comes to doing it? I mean, is there some formal framework in which you can do that, or is this just a question of talking about it more?
Well, I think this is actually one of the big pushes that that we were making in the report, is that I think it's a call to action for a formal framework. And at least from my point of view at McKinsey, we're committed to investing to work with industry players to say, can we actually align on a set of standards here and actually get started? And my sense is we look for synergy rather than complexity. So as we think about all of the, again, I'm using private sector analogy, but all the disclosures we make across ESG, if you think about a component in G in particular, why isn't there a conversation explicitly on resilience? How resilient, when you think of governance, are you as an entity?
ESGR. It's going to be ESGR.
Yeah, or a subpart, right? So that it's not getting more complicated, but it actually becomes a set of metrics.
I think one of the best proxies for an index is diversity. Whether that's global geographic diversity or business line diversity, and that's a little bit easier to measure in the absence of an index that's perhaps calculated more specifically. I think that is something that, again, 3 decades ago was valued very highly. I think it came off as a priority and a focus area for investors in the last decade. But recently, I think that's increased quite significantly, and I think it'll hopefully increase in the coming decade.
Good. More questions? Yes, lady at the back there.
Ling Trailing from Channel News Asia in Singapore. You said that there was a metric perhaps that we could use, that we could develop for measuring perhaps people in public office. Well, may I suggest that one of them would be whether or not you carried your little sister for 3 miles because she was sick with malaria to a doctor, and if you can tick on that box, then perhaps you are a resilient public figure. That's something that Madame Ngozi has done, so just a suggestion. But more seriously, Madame Ngozi, the question for you is, you said that we've lost the feeling of global solidarity. Well, perhaps being a cynical journalist, I would say perhaps we never had the feeling of solidarity. And that when we talk about resilience, we really talk about resilience only for your own company, your own family, your own country, and nothing more than that. And that a very good example also is that we tend to look at things, you say, you shouldn't break into blocks. Well, RCEP is now the biggest trading bloc in the world. It is not related to WTO. So we are already building things, and we are building things not necessarily in global solidarity and only really for the resilience of certain parts of the world. But shouldn't we just embrace that reality rather than deluding ourselves that we're such a happy family?
Well, the answer is no, in short order. So let me tell you why. These institutions and this global solidarity that was put in place was after the world had gone through a series of shocks. The war, the Great Depression, all that. And the world, people saw that this wasn't going to work. So for 75 years, the system that was put in place has delivered. Has it delivered perfectly? The answer is no. Obviously, there are people who have been left, poor people within rich countries and poor countries who've not benefited from this whole system. But grosso modo, it has worked. There haven't been the kinds of wars on a global scale or in the developed countries that we're seeing now. We've had wars in developing countries, which don't, people don't talk about as much. But it's rendered some benefits and lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. Trade has been a huge part of that. If you think of what China's GDP was when it tried to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, I think it was 1.6 trillion around that. And today is about 15 trillion compared to the US's 20. Nobody thought that they would grow that fast. And how did they do it? It's through trade, open economies, and so on. So it has delivered. The regional trading blocks and bilateral are fine. If you look at the statistics, you see that 75% of world trade still takes place on MFN terms, on WTO terms, and 22% takes place on the terms done by these trades. So I think largely we are still following those WTO terms, but they need to be upgraded. So I would not say it's broken, that we never had it. I think where you're right is that it's eroding. It's eroding rapidly, and we are not thinking of the consequences of this erosion. We are very lazy. It's very easy to talk about blocks and, let's hang together and so on. But the WTO economists have just done some simulations of what would it cost if we broke into, let's just take 2 trading blocks. And those simulations show that just from the loss of technological spillovers and economies of scale, it would cost the world 5% of real GDP over the longer term, just to 2 blocks. And that's not taking into account other types of, barriers that would come up if you broke into. 5% of the world's GDP is not trivial. It's very costly, just like the type of simulation. Yeah. So I challenge them to do that, just to show the world what's the counterfactual if we break in. So let's not, we're eroding, but let's be conscious of the direction. So you have a very important point. But if we go in that way, it's going to cost us more as a community than anything.
More questions. So did see a couple of hands goes up. Yes, sir.
Sam Alamayo, a young global leader, Cambridge Industries.
You got a mic.
Sorry. This was a fascinating panel. Really enjoyed it, and I think we don't want Ministry of Resiliency, but head of resiliency or a resiliency score. My question is, and I've gotten this image now, resiliency being kind of a shock observer, trying to have almost like a spring that we have in a car. There are lots of industries that have mandated, regulated resiliency within their system, be it in the financial sector of how much reserve that they need to have when they're lending, even the airline industry of how much reserve fuel it needs to have in its design. Where is the role of regulation as well as kind of global requirements when it comes to resiliency? Because that lack of resiliency, it adds for that short-term benefit, but long-term, it is detrimental for all of society, as we've seen. So where the role of regulation, and regulation could also create more problems. How do we balance that with the private sectors and governments?
I'm happy to start. I think you're right. Regulation firstly does have a role, and that's probably not something that you hear too many CEOs say. But I do think there is an important role that regulators play in terms of making sure that there's resilience. And the primary objective of most regulators is to protect end consumers. So that end is where companies and regulators are aligned. The problem often is that if you look at regulation as being the only way to solve the problem, is that it's a stick. And it can't be just a stick. I think the solution has to be both a carrot and a stick, and it has to be motivated through a desire to get to the right outcome. So I think you raise a good point. I do think regulators can play a key role in building resiliency, and I think it is about working with institutions and industries to try to find the right balance and the right formula for it. The only challenge I often see with regulation is that it, again, looks through the rearview mirror. Most regulations typically come from looking at the past, and there's not enough forward thinking as it relates to regulation.
Bob?
Yeah, I'd build. I think there has to be multiple legs in the stool, and I do think regulation has a key role to play. to ensure that as you look cross-industry, minimum standards are complied with. Regulation, as Roy points out, is rarely leading edge. and so I kind of view it as a floor. When you look at multiple stakeholders and you look at how most private enterprise has moved on climate commitments, it's not been through regulation. Right? It's been through other stakeholders. So that's why I think there's some real power in this transparency. How do you get financial markets? How do you get other stakeholders interested in this notion of transparency? So it's multiple. The only other one I'd put is there's also a little bit of implicit of, okay, what does the public sector do and what does the private sector do? And those are two different entities. I wonder if one of the real unlocks for resiliency is actually public-private cooperation, as opposed to thinking about silos between the two. Because these are integrated value chains that play across public and private players. And there's going to have to be, I think, a level of cooperation that we haven't seen before if we really want to get this right.
Gozi, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, just I agree with everything that Bob and Roy have said. Just thinking that there are a couple of layers. You know, you were very right. You know, you have these built-in, you can call them resiliencies in various industries, if we want to use that word. But it's in the self-interest of the private sector or a company to be resilient. They ought to want it. So I'm thinking at one level, you know, self-regulation. You know, if like industries get together and see what they need to do to be resilient, because it's in their interest. That's one layer. The other layer, as you say, is government. And government has an interest because people are invested in these companies and they want to make sure they're doing the right thing. But you need something to regulate against. Yep. So this issue of disclosure and standards, I very much want to agree. That's the way we need to think about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all become a little more resilient in the course of the last hour. With or without a Ministry of Resilience, we've demonstrated we don't need that or perhaps regulation either. But I want to thank you all very much indeed for coming, and especially please thank our panel.
Thank you.